For centuries, the Vikings were the nightmare that stirred fear in European monasteries, villages, and fortresses. With their axes wrapped in fury and their longships with dragon heads, they became the ultimate symbol of conquest. But even the most powerful dreams can be invaded by shadows. There are stories that remain untold because they defy the narrative of the invincible. There are corners on medieval maps where silence weighs more than ink. In that frozen void east of the known world, where the trees whisper warnings and the snow does not forget, lived a tribe that the Vikings did not conquer, because they could not. This tale is not about the Vikings who dominated the sea, but about those who feared the forest. Welcome to the story of the Biamios, the invisible, the arcane, those who turned war into a dance of silence. This is the hidden side of Viking fear. And you are about to cross the threshold. Before starting this video, remember to subscribe and like. In the European chronicles of the early Middle Ages, the Vikings rose as a force that did not ask permission to write their history. They crossed seas, burned abbeys, plundered mercilessly, and left behind only ashes and new names carved in the fear of those who survived. Their longships, with dragon heads that seemed to spit the mist, were more than ships, they were omens. Each oar marked the rhythm of misfortune. Each gleaming shield was the promise of an imminent attack. For many peoples, resistance was futile. But even in that tale of absolute power, there are gaps. Cracks through which their own silences seep. Deep in the Scandinavian imagination, honor was tied to steel. Dying in combat was a direct pass to Valhalla. Surrender had no translation. Northern warriors learned from childhood to wield axes, to throw spears, to shout with fury. And yet, there are stories that weren't told around the fire. Stories that were whispered, as if speaking them aloud would awaken something dormant. One such tale spoke of the eastern fringes. Of lands covered by mist and forest where compasses were lost and echoes didn't respond. It was said that it was unwise to venture too far. Not out of lack of courage, but out of respect for the inexplicable. In the margins of poorly drawn maps, where rivers freeze without warning and trees gather like guardians, there existed a faceless warning. The lands of the White Forest are not for us. That phrase appears, almost hidden, in several sagas. Not as part of a story, but as a reminder. Some of the most legendary warriors of Norway and Denmark tried their luck. Their names graced songs, but when it came to the Biamians, the music stopped. What seemed like another plundering raid turned into a march of no return. There was no glorious combat, no exchange of swords. Only shadows, silence, and men who didn't return. Who were these guardians? How did a tribe from far away from the seas manage to twist the fate of those who ruled them? The Vikings couldn't explain. And that silence, more than any defeat, is proof that terror can also disguise itself as respect. Thus begins this story. Not that of the conqueror, but of the one conquered by fear. The one who saw his reflection in the treetops and understood that some battles are not fought with strength, but with knowledge of the terrain, of spirit, and of silence. Here begins the tale of the only tribe that managed to turn the Viking into a legend, not for what he did, but for what he couldn't do. What is barely mentioned in the Viking sagas was experienced with brutal intensity in the heart of the north. There, where light seems to fear the horizon and winter dominates even the will, the Biamios existed. They were not marked on maps. They did not trade in bustling markets or raise banners proclaiming glory. They were part of the landscape, not the one to be admired, but the one to be feared. The Vikings, experts at navigating coasts and destroying walls, encountered more than physical obstacles in that territory. They faced an environment that refused to be conquered. Imagine a land of forests so dense that sound was lost before reaching the trees. Frozen tundras where every step was a promise of pain. The cold wasn't a season. It was an adversary the Biami had tamed. They moved with a disturbing ease along invisible paths, where the ice crunched for others but not for them. Their half-buried dwellings retained heat as if mocking nature itself, and their architectural vestiges spoke of an intelligence born not of excess, but of survival. The Norse raids that dared to penetrate that geography began to change in tone. They were no longer swift victories or glorious plunders. The warriors of the sea, clad in iron and pride, faced enemies who were not there to face them face to face. War for the Biamios was a symphony of disappearances. Silent arrows designed to pierce without warning. Light bows that rose from the shadows. Footprints that disappeared in seconds. Battles no longer had a beginning and an end. They were episodes of terror that began with doubt and ended with death, without the aggressor even being able to see the defender. And when they tried to understand what was happening, they only found traps. Traps made of trees that fell like judgments, pits camouflaged by the snow, networks of branches that led the enemy to their doom. It was not the strategy of someone who wanted to show superiority, but of someone who wanted to preserve invisibility. Even the terrain became an accomplice, causing fire to emerge from the ice, disorienting those who believed they dominated nature. There was an expedition in which 30 men set out and only 7 returned. They didn't report seeing an army. They didn't describe shouts or clashes. They only spoke of shadows, of sounds that weren't sounds, of death that came without a name. And therein lies true terror, not in what is visible, but in what cannot be described. The Vikings could fight against kings, against rival clans, against storms. But how do you fight an enemy that doesn't show up? How do you face the forest when the forest is the one attacking? The Biamios not only survived. They redefined combat. They transformed it into a test of perception, of psychological endurance. While the warriors of the sea polished their axes and reinforced their shields, in the frozen heart of the north, a much more powerful legend was woven. That of a people who didn't need to show their strength, because their territory, their silence, and their shadow spoke for them. And that was the nightmare the Vikings never told out loud. The Vikings' true defeats against the Biamians occurred not only in battle, but in spirit. As they ventured into the lands of the White Forest, they discovered funerary practices that contradicted everything they held sacred. Bodies were not cremated, but preserved. And the graves were not decorated with weapons, but with symbolic patterns that seemed to converse with the stars. For the Norse, this was not just strange, it was taboo. Death was to be liberated by fire, not frozen in silence. Even more disconcerting was the presence of women in combat, not as exceptions, but as an essential part of the tribal structure. They hunted, led, and made decisions. Varangian tales mention how a Biamian woman's arrow found its target with the same precision as any warrior's. Authority did not revolve around a patriarch, it seemed to flow from the collective, from the ancestral. This broke the mold of clans and lineages that the Vikings considered unbreakable. The boundaries of Biamian territory were marked with abstract symbols, animals, and figures that did not correspond to Viking art. Carved posts served as silent warnings. This is as far as you can go. To cross them without permission was to invoke something more than death. It was to tempt invisible forces that fought not with steel, but with nature itself. And although there was bloodshed, there was also a truce. At certain points, trade took place without words. Both peoples left their goods in agreed-upon areas and withdrew, leaving the other to collect theirs. It was a pact without written agreements, born of respect and fear. Because there, whoever spoke first might not return. The defeats left deep marks, reinforced shields, new protection, armor adapted for an enemy that didn't show itself. But what was most revealing was what the Vikings avoided. It wasn't about surrender, but about recognizing that even fury has limits. And in the White Forest, those limits were sacred. The Biamios didn't conquer Viking lands. They made the Vikings decide not to conquer theirs. And that imposed silence, that forced respect, was the only nightmare the warriors of the North ever sang of. Because there are enemies who are not conquered by the sword, but by what they represent. And the Biamios represented what neither fury, nor fire, nor steel could subdue. The echo of Viking drums still resonates in books, films, and legends. But there are defeats that go unsung, and enemies that have no name but a presence. The Biamios didn't need to conquer territories or raise monuments to leave their mark. Their legacy is written in what the Norse avoided, in the routes they never explored, in the nightmares they didn't tell. The fear they sowed was not of the edge of steel, but of the territory where the logic of war lost meaning. For the Vikings, dying with a sword in hand was glory. For the Biamios, avoiding battle was wisdom. Thus ended the arrogance of the sea in the face of respect for the land. Thus was born the border of silence. Now when people talk about Vikings, listen carefully. If there are pauses, if there are fragments, if there are sighs, there may be the whisper of the Biamios. The one tribe that taught the warriors of the north that even terror has its reflection. As always, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe and leave a like. See you in the next video.